Welcome again to Community Planning Conversations. Today our conversation is with Thomas Kamm, who is an architect and a professor in the School of Architecture. Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Patsy.
You primarily teach courses in design in the School of Architecture. So why is design important?
Well, I think that we, as a society, tend to underestimate how much it affects mood, how much it affects the way we operate on a daily basis. What I try to impart to my students is that design can happen at many different scales. It can happen, from the design of your pen here, the good design of a pen that looks beautiful and is easy to use, to the design of a house that somebody would be living in, the spaces that they occupy in the house, to the design of a city neighborhood, that's based on a group of those kinds of houses. And so, good design at all of those levels really impacts the way we work every day, the way our moods are. Affects our psychology, and I think that we tend to sort of underestimate how that works. I think we have. Everyone probably has good experiences of visiting places in their memories that they, in say foreign cities or even in our own town here, that have had some kind of real impact on them. A space or a building that they visited that has really sort of impacted the way they feel, the way their mood is, the way they think about architecturally designed spaces. And I guess what I try and do is make sure that when I'm teaching and when I'm practicing, that all the levels from the detail level up to the larger level of design are considered, and that good design comes about in each of those, so that the experience for anyone who's using a house I might design, or a school that I work, for instance, on the Leal School here as the addition to Leal School.
Leal School in Urbana.
In Urbana. That those spaces are wonderful to be in, as well as very functional, useful spaces. So I think that we've, as a culture, design goes back to its earliest roots in designing of shelter, designing of tools, designing clothing, to keep us warm. And there's, in addition to all the useful aspects of shelter, there's always been some kind of an aesthetic or artistic impulse to, even the earliest tools, for instance, have some effort at ornamentation on those tools. How do you take what was originally a very simple shelter and begin to elaborate on that to make it a beautiful shelter? Those kinds of impulses, that kind of artistic impulse to elaborate on what is a basic need, is kind of where the beauty comes in the design world. And that sense of beauty, I think, is something that we, all as designers, all strive for, to give people that in their daily lives. So.
But unfortunately, we seem to have a lot of mundane design in our country. How do we get this paradigm shift in thinking so people are concerned about design and recognize what it does to them, which you've just described? How do we get McDonald's to rethink what they're doing, or how do we get a gas station
It's interesting.
company?
I mean, you cite two examples: McDonald's and Mobil Oil, or
Right,
or
Walgreens.
Walgreens. I think what happens is that when design becomes formulaic, it loses a lot of its direct impact on people. So even in suburban housing production in neighborhoods around the country, the types of houses that are created, I think, have become formulaic in many ways, and so they lose the sort of specific intent to create a special and perhaps unique situation for somebody who's going to eat at McDonald's, or somebody who's going to eat, or who's going to live in a suburban house in a nice subdivision. And so it's difficult because McDonald's and any franchise situation is in the business of mass producing what they do. So they've come up with an initial concept, which then is reiterated ad nauseum throughout the country. And what you do find, though, is in different markets, McDonald's will actually change what they do because they recognize that there's a public there who wants something more out of their McDonald's than the standard variety that we see here, and or in most places around the country. So in urban settings, for instance, or in lower Manhattan, there's a McDonald's that is a very different type of McDonald's than you would find on the side of the interstate, right?
As compared to the new one in Chicago on,
right.
on Clark.
What's the rock and roll McDonald's on? Yeah, is that the one you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean that's a one-off type of situation, and what's great about that is that, I mean, for better or worse, whether you like it or not, it's designed to be a unique experience as opposed to being something that's created from a formula, and it is kind of a paradox to say, well, everything should be designed specifically to the user. We can't do that, and we can't produce an individual item for each of the users that's individually tailored to them all the time. I guess the goal would be to recognize when things have become so formulaic, though, that they're acting to our detriment psychologically or in terms of use or in terms of creating public space, for instance. A lot of, to go back to the McDonald's example, that is really about, for the most part, about drive-through traffic, right? So you want to get people in and out as quickly as possible, and they're usually also about the car, integrating the car into the experience. Well, that's a very different type of design problem than designing something for a downtown city block district where you want to encourage pedestrian traffic. And a lot of what we do in this country is really based around the car, how we use the car to get in and out quickly of all of the things that we need to get done in our lives. And I think that to a large extent has degraded the pedestrian environment in our country. And it's one of the things that new urbanists talk about a lot is the notion of trying to reintroduce good pedestrian environments in our country. And I have we can talk a little bit more about that, but I have a lot of concerns about the images that a lot of the new urbanists communities are trying to promote, but the idea of reintroducing pedestrian-friendly environments is incredibly important, I think, both for the visual environment, for our health, so that people are actually out getting exercise as opposed to driving 5 blocks to get something to eat, that they could actually walk that, and right now our environments don't really encourage that, I don't think.
Well, let's capture you introducing new urbanism. I was going to bring that up a little bit later in our conversation, and some of it, the reason I was going to bring it up is Andres Duani, one of several people who has now put new urbanism in our everyday vocabulary.
Right.
He has put together a team of about 100, mostly architects, some urban planners who are down in the Gulf disaster area. And I was going to ask you, is this the best possible way to be helpful to go down there in a team like that to think through some of the redesign, integrating what you just talked about? How do you design for more walkability? How do you capture some of the history that's been wiped out down there? They're talking about getting rid of the shotgun houses, which are very historic down in that area. So what are your thoughts about that?
There are, they are not the only group that has turned their attention to, how to rebuild after a disaster. American Institute of Architects has got a large group, a task force that has been trying to ensure that the money that is spent wisely. there's a huge amount of money that's going to be dedicated to rebuilding the areas that were hit by the disaster. And I think that what the American Institute of Architects is trying to do is to make sure that it's spent wisely and that it's not wasted on things that could be, in the end, are not going to benefit us. And I think that that's also what this group of architects is probably. You're referring to the Congress for New Urbanism, or people from the Congress from New
Well,
for New Urbanism,
I can't put it in that context.
Yeah.
I do know it's being sponsored by the Knight Foundation.
Uh-huh.
And
Well-
that's how the funds were put together to bring this group of individuals. And they're down in Mississippi. And the reason they're in Mississippi is because Andres Duany has a personal friendship with the governor of Mississippi. And so that kind of gives
Sure.
a historic framework on how this evolved.
Sure. Well, I think that there is sometimes there's a confusion between the sort of historical leanings of new urbanism and the kind of structural idea of creating good communities that are walkable communities that have mixed use in them, that promote healthy urban space. I think that those are the tenets of new urbanism that's probably the most interesting to me, is that there's a concentration on creating good public space, that buildings are used in some ways to frame public space and to create environments that people in cities want to be in, and that are healthy environments and, beautiful environments to be in. The historical aspect of it, and I think new urbanism looked at historical precedents originally to say, well, how, we had really good communities and that we built all through the turn of the century and up to the 20s. How did we do that, and why are things the way they are now, and how can we improve them, and look to the past for a precedent? Well, I think that the historical precedent is very good, but then I think that you can take that a step further to say, well, how is that reinterpreted for today, in terms of the design that reflects design of today. And a lot of those principles still hold true, but I think that maybe some of the formal characteristics are somehow maybe not as relevant. But to get back to your question about getting rid of the shotgun houses, for instance, those are incredibly important traditions. It's a unique building type in New Orleans, and I think should be preserved. And so, if that's and I'm not familiar with what the charge of the group of architects is.
I don't know what the charge is either.
But I imagine part of it is historical preservation, which I'm, a great believer in. I don't think that we want to get rid of our resources either from a cultural point of view or from a, economic and energy resource conservation point of view. I think that those are all important things.
Just for a moment of clarification, so our audience
Sure.
doesn't wonder about this. I think some of the issue on the shotgun houses is that they're in the Ninth Ward. A predominant number of them are in the Ninth Ward area, and the Ninth Ward area in New Orleans got so deeply flooded, as you're well aware of, and so the thought of just bulldozing the area.
Well, and those houses
That's-
also, just so the audience knows a little bit more about what the shotgun house is, it was, as I understand it, originally taxation in New Orleans was based on street frontage. So there developed logically, as a response to the market, there developed this very, very long, deep house that had a minimum of street frontage on it. And it was a series of rooms that go back in the house with one long corridor that you could essentially, line up at the front of the house and shoot a shotgun through the house, and it would come out the back door, and nothing would be hit. So it's a unique housing type in America. Probably one of the reasons that they're considering getting rid of it is that they're wood frame houses for the most part, and would be the ones that were the most damaged by any kind of flooding, and the resulting mold that grows in wood once it's wet, and all of that stuff. To the amount of investment to keep these houses probably would outweigh bulldozing them and building new tract housing there.
Right.
And, there's also the sense that, some of the people in these neighborhoods would like to have new, suburban style houses as opposed to old houses. It's a paradox, but, there are people in underserved neighborhoods who are given the opportunity to have design services to build new structures, new housing for themselves, oftentimes really want what they see other people have, which is, the I guess the ultimate model is the suburban standalone house. And so it would be a shame, I think, if a type of house that's very specific to one region of our country
Right.
disappeared because of economic reasons, I guess. So
Right. Can you
again, how do you combat that though? Because we're a market-driven housing environment.
that's
and
a real problem
and
down there.
well, it's the case everywhere.
But this one is such
Yeah.
a big rush,
Right. Sure.
rush in there.
Sure. Yeah.
It's a little hard
Right.
to slow down the momentum
Mhm.
that's happening. Can you give us an example of good new urbanism design in our communities, or if not here, other places, so people begin to recognize what you have been describing?
And again, I'm not an expert on this on new urbanism. I'm familiar with
Or
a lot of the
your
projects that early projects, which I could talk about some of them. A lot of the projects in the beginning of this idea of new urbanism were large-scale developments that were essentially farmland, like what we have here, where a farmer would sell off 40 or 80 acres of an area outside of Gaithersburg, Maryland, let's say, where there's a project called Kentlands in Maryland. And rather than say, why don't we do the typical cul-de-sac development where you have an arterial road with a spine road that comes off of that feeds a bunch of cul-de-sacs that are all separated from each other, and everybody goes to their house and parks in their in their garage in their cul-de-sac, and when they want to go to the store, they have to go back out the spine, back out the arterial to the major road, and there's only one way to get there. Rather than doing that, what in Kentlands as an example, what they did was establish a community with community centers and a network of streets that join up all of those areas. It's very much like what happens in all the nice neighborhoods in Champaign, older neighborhoods in Champaign and Urbana, where essentially you've got a grid, and you can choose how you go, where you go, and if there is, and you can walk. Things are close enough that you can walk to. I live on John Street, for instance, and I can walk to downtown Champaign if I have 10 minutes to do that. That's great, and I don't have to be driving there to go get a bite to eat. That's the kind of lifestyle that they were trying to promote, and so early on, a lot of the projects were all about large-scale developments and trying to change the way people thought about these large-scale developments to actually add neighborhood centers, to add a radius of walking that was no more than 5 minutes to get to things like schools or a library or something like that. And from that, then it's a new town center that things could grow out of. I think where new urbanism is finding a challenge now is how do these ideas come back and reflect on already existing communities, right? In a downtown urban center, in a town like Champaign or Urbana, where you have some existing fabric, and you don't have the ability to take 40 acres and create a new town center, but you're doing sort of more surgical insertions into a town center to say, well, how can you plan for development over the next 20 years that is going to give you the kind of urban environment that you want to have, or downtown environment that you want to have. And that's a different prospect than saying, let's lay out a site plan for a new 40-acre development that's going to have its own town centers in it,
Right.
and it's going to be built in the next 4 years and occupied.
Right.
That's a very different proposition. So, and I think that they've gone some ways toward addressing that issue by reinterpreting what zoning means. And I know when Andres Durrani was here 2 years ago as part
Right.
of our lecture series
Mhm.
program at the architecture school, that he was talking a lot about how that work is being done. It's reinterpreting zoning. So typically zoning in a city environment is thought about how you separate uses, so that you don't want to have industrial use right next to a residential use. That's bad planning because of the health effects and the noise impact and the impact of what could be a nasty visual environment on what could be a really domestically beautiful environment. And what they've started to do is look at it more from the aspect of perhaps mixing up uses, but saying that there are certain densities that you want to strive for, that a high density wouldn't be good right next to an extremely low density kind of environment. So that again, you could mix uses within one neighborhood if it were of a certain density, and all of this density is looked at as how you create public space with either the buildings or the functions of the buildings that you've got going around them. And it's a new, they're trying to help communities rewrite their zoning codes or overlay something else on top of their zoning codes that will promote a vision that these communities have for themselves 20 years from now or 50 years from now even.
I want to
So-
capture a couple of things that you have brought out in what you were talking about. And one is that new urbanism is probably old urbanism design.
Right, it's
And-
traditionalist urbanism.
And
almost,
you
yeah.
mentioned that,
Yeah.
and then you brought up as an example the Kentlands.
Mhm.
And not only is that a new urbanism design, but they also did a lot with the environment and sustainability.
Mhm.
You want to
yeah,
talk about that?
I think from a site design point of view, they tried to retain all of the prominent natural features in the area. So, as I recall, there was the original farmstead was there with a lake pond adjacent to the farmstead, and there were some old growth trees that were on the property, so that there was an effort to create a large greensward that was incorporated the farmhouse, which became some kind of community center or community accessible building.
Right.
And that there was then a large area of what was the most interesting topography, also probably the least buildable because of the water on it. That was given away to green space that was collective green space for the community. And by doing that, then you have less built area, you have less imperviable surface, you have less problem with stormwater runoff. You're able to treat that stormwater runoff, as draining into the soil as opposed to running off into big storm
And that's what
sewer
you mean by
systems.
impervious surface.
Impervious surface would be
Right.
any kind of paved surface where water falls, or even roof surface, water falls, it has to be collected somewhere and gotten rid of. Whereas if it's on grass, or if it's on open land, it falls and it soaks into the ground and you're done with it. So other aspects of sustainability in that community would be the fact that people can walk to their services.
Right.
So
Right.
right away it creates better air quality because there's less driving going on. It creates less use of resources and fossil fuel because people are driving less, creates better exercise scenarios for people. And one thing that they tried to do there, which has had mixed success, is they were trying to tie it to a regional shopping area
Mm-hmm.
that would serve, similar to what we have going on North Prospect, but redesigned in a way that was more pedestrian-friendly
Mhm.
use and could be walked to from the neighborhoods
Right.
as opposed to walking, having to drive there. That it would serve a regional clientele, catchment area, who would be driving to this, but could also serve as a neighborhood walk-in shopping area for the people who lived in the Kentlands. And that is a great, I think a great sort of paradigm shift, or a way to recast what happens with big box retail as we have it in this town, to say, how can it be rethought so that it is a really good mix of cars, pedestrian,
Right.
environment. And what we have here, I think, is the ultimate sort of formulaic response to, and bottom line response to, big box retail. And you see, as I was talking about with McDonald's in Lower Manhattan, which is, got marble and, it's 2 stories and it's got the mezzanines and beautiful lighting and everything. Even big box retail, when it's in areas where there is a demand for better design, has responded to that to
Right.
create. They're fake, but they're sort of
They fit in better.
They're town center like kind of things. So that at least there's a recognition that we can do something different than just a sea of asphalt and the box, removed from the frontage road kind of.
So
thing.
you're saying if a community really wants to have change, that
I
the
think
big
it's-
corporations and
I-
big boxes
I think it's market-
don't run away, they do
I
work
think it's
with
market
community.
driven. I think it's market driven, and that is to say that why would I, if I lived if I lived in suburban Virginia, why would I go to one big box center over another big box center when they have essentially the same stores in them?
Mm-hmm.
And I would choose to go to the one that is the nicest shopping experience for me.
Right, that looks better.
That looks
Right.
better.
Right.
And provides a good place for me to be. And so in that, there are the people who are now starting to design these things are recognizing that there is a call for, or a desire to have nicer designed environments. And I think in general, who was it that said that we're living in the age of the designer now, almost. That it's there was a conference here on campus, a design conference. It was interdisciplinary design conference, industrial design, architecture,
Yes,
graphic
right,
design,
right.
last year. And one of the keynote speakers was Kareem Rashid, who does a lot of product design, industrial design, very well known name in the design field. And part of the discussion talked about when you across the world, there's developing this kind of homogenous culture, which is a consumer culture in a way. The cultural differences are beginning to almost disappear between towns in the United States, or between countries. That people are buying essentially the same thing. That they're marketed. The same things are being marketed to them. He said, in a situation where cultural differences are so becoming so blurred, that more and more people are turning to designers to invent differences, so that people then have a choice almost of how they depict themselves. So, whereas a cultural difference may have eroded between here and Pakistan, the difference between Sony and another company in terms of its image is and whether you buy Sony or you buy another company is all important in terms of defining self. And it's a sad commentary, I suppose, on the difference between cultural identities. And maybe it's an extreme one, but there's something to be said for then the role of the designer in relationship to that. Who is there to say what my style should be?
Well, and I was also thinking that in the resolution of economic development in communities, they're sort of folding back to the same thing you're talking about. A Walgreens does. You have a cookie cutter design and you just go into a community and use that design. Well, communities are sort of doing the same thing in solving economic development. They bring in the big boxes and all the big boxes look the same, and this contributes to this
Homogenization of our landscape, really
Good.
across the country.
good
Yeah,
good way
yeah.
to good
No,
way to
it's
put it.
absolutely true. And in residential development is, I think, very much the same thing. You know, if I go to New Jersey, or I go to Southern California, or I go to Southwest Champaign, or Southeast Urbana, there is a similarity in terms of styles of development that is kind of homogeneous across the country.
Right.
There are certainly regional flavors to what goes on there, but the paradigm kind of remains the same, and that's what I think that's really what the market is calling for. So people are responding to that.
Well, is that what the market's calling for, or is that what people think is all that they can ask for?
I think there's some of both. And I think that there's there may be a low bar for what people are expecting out of design, and
Our level of tolerance.
our level of tolerance in their built environment. I think, again, it gets back to the formulaic versus the individual, and for me, that's where I think housing production in this country has always been influenced by a successful model that is then repeated, or a series of successful models that have been repeated. If you look at the way housing is produced in Brooklyn, for instance, or was produced in Brooklyn when all the townhouses were built, you walk through a neighborhood in Brooklyn and you can see that there are, between 1900 and 1920, there are, 5 basic models of a row house that were created, that are recreated and ornamented differently or decorated differently, but it's basically the same type of model. And many of those were, there was one, as in suburban development here, there was a builder who had 5 models that you could choose from.
Right.
And those are the fabric of those neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and serve people to this day with good housing in those neighborhoods. That being said, though, I think that there are so there's the unique and the formulaic, and maybe because there is the formulaic, the unique has a different place and can be seen more as more clearly as in the field of things that are the same. I don't know.
Well, I want to capture something else
Sure.
that you talked about, sort of slipped it in, and that is bringing speakers
Yeah.
into our community. Another role you have within the School of Architecture is scheduling the fall and spring speaker series. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and what a nice contribution it is to the community in being able to come to the campus, to the Buell Hall, and listen to these outside speakers who will talk about some of the things that you have just been expounding on. And
Expounding? Was that, have I been expounding?
talking about.
You asked me not to expound when I came here, so I hope I haven't been.
But this is a great way for people in the community to learn about these
Yeah.
different ideas. And you and I are working on a speaker for spring semester, Michael Piatek. So if you will talk about those, and I'll hold up the poster
Sure,
so people
yeah.
can start getting some sense
Well,
of who's coming this fall.
First of all, I just want to reiterate what you said. Is this is an architecture lecture series sponsored by the School of Architecture. Happens every spring and fall semester. Typically, we have about 6 to 8 speakers per semester who come from all over the country. And it's open to the public. There's no charge for it.
Right.
And we encourage people. Some of our most regular attendees have nothing to do with the architecture school or design in general, but are just interested in the topic. So I would encourage anyone who wants to come to the lecture series to do that.
And this year
it's
you've added the factor of continuing professional
right.
education
So
credits.
for those, I'm glad you brought that up. For those people who are members of either licensed architects or members of AIA as well,
Or
you'll be
even
able to-
Allied Fields.
Allied Fields,
Right.
ALA. You can get 1 hour of credit for continuing education credit for attending the lectures. So this semester we've had a focus on architects who are practicing in the Pacific Northwest, many of whom have sustainability as one of the centerpieces of their architectural practice.
Stop for a moment
Yeah.
and just,
Talk about sustainability.
yeah, just explain it briefly
Well,
so everybody understands how you're using the term.
It's sort of the lay term would be being more green, I guess, right?
Okay.
So environmentally friendly,
Okay.
and that is achieved in many ways in the built environment. I think I've heard estimated that 75% of the energy that we use as a society is embodied in the buildings that we make.
It is. It is.
75 to 80%.
Yes.
In the construction of the buildings, in the materials, the manufacture of the materials, the transportation of the materials, and the
Right.
operation of the buildings.
And then
75
also,
to 80% of our energy use is wrapped up in buildings.
and
so,
then when they're raised, then they go to the landfill.
right,
That's
right.
part
so
of that.
it's a huge issue if we're committed to shepherding our resources on the planet more responsibly. It's a huge issue how we build, and how we think about building, and how we maintain existing structures, and how we build more responsibly in the future. So there's it's been growing really since the energy crisis of the 70s. There's been a consciousness in the building industry and in design fields that there is this component of how can we conserve in what we do. It's only been, I would say, in the last 10 years that has really started to snowball in terms of not only architects and engineers' views of things, but also the expectation on the part of clients that this is something that we should be focusing on, and public clients in particular. That we should really be focusing on how we can minimize the use of resources, minimize the impact, maximize how efficient a building is, minimize how much energy it uses to operate. These kinds of things are all part of what it means to be sustainable as an architect now. And it's really, hopefully, it's not something that is just a fad in the practice now, but is really is a change in the way we're thinking about building the environment, because we need it.
Well,
And,
in a way, we're folding back historically, too, because there were the days when the bricks were made of the land where the house was going to be
Right.
built, and they built the
Right.
furnace right there, and
Right,
they fired
exactly.
the bricks, and they just
And if there was
built
not
it
mud to
up.
make bricks, you made it out of wood, because that was the available material.
whatever,
And you
yeah.
had stone, and you made it out of stone, and that was what was
And straw
available.
bale.
Right. So yeah, part of the way to there's now become a way to evaluate how sustainable a project is, or a built project is, which is something called the LEEDS rating.
good. I'm glad you brought that up.
And it's a way to evaluate on a number of different scales how effective you are at creating green buildings. And those can be from, as I mentioned before, from how far away you bring materials, is the embodied transportation energy to bring materials to a built project, to how if you have to demolish something, where do you take it? Can you demolish it and keep it on site and
Right.
create some kind of a landform out of it as part of a project? It can be you can go to the materials that you choose to go into a building that create healthier environments, so that they don't off-gas, for instance, the materials that are more naturally based that don't off-gas. So again, I started out talking about the sort of the macro level to the micro level of design. the LEEDS rating looks at all of those levels, from from community resources down and site resources down to the level of the choice of the materials on the windowsill here in the studio, for instance. So.
We have a nice example of a LEED-rated building in Normal, Illinois.
I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
The Children's Discovery
Uh-huh.
Museum
Okay,
there.
sure.
The mayor in Normal wanted green construction, so they're the only community that has a green building ordinance. And then the Children's Discovery Museum, and because of that strong statement by that community, the new building the Bank of Illinois is building in Normal will have a LEED rating. So there's sort of a fallout once a community makes a very strong community
Sure.
statement to implement
Right.
exactly what you've been describing.
The university is actually will start soon construction on their first LEED rated. I think it's a gold rating. And the LEED rating has silver, gold, and platinum. I think are
Right.
the three levels for the sort of ecologically friendly level of the buildings. And the new business school, which has been designed by Caesar Pelli and Associates out of their New York office, is the first building that the campus has really said, well, we're going to commit ourselves to doing a LEED-rated building on the campus, and it should be very exciting to see what happens with the building.
To watch
I'm
it go
excited.
up, and
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
building that's going to be on Armory and 6th.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So
across from
folks
the
in the
business school now.
community
Yeah.
can
across from
watch.
the business school now. Yeah, and it's a really interesting building. It incorporated a lot of sustainable features into the building.
Well,
something you brought up, I think I
Yes.
wanted to touch on,
Yes.
which was that Normal actually passed an ordinance about
Green building.
Green building.
They have a
It's-
green building ordinance, and it applies to anything that's built that's public use and might have some public funds involved with it, hence the Children's Discovery Museum.
Uh-huh. I guess what I wanted to respond to is the not specifically about a green building ordinance, but about ordinances in general, or about design review in
Yes.
general.
Yes.
I think that there is a feeling in many communities that if there is any kind of serious design review or any kind of serious requirements placed on builders that would improve the built environment, that they won't build. That it will just chase away business. And so I'm really happy to hear that Normal, for instance, has decided to go ahead with something like this. Admittedly, it's things that are built in the public sector, which they have control over.
But that's why I mentioned
But-
the Bank of Illinois building, because
Right, it's in response to that.
it's in response to that. Yes, exactly.
And so I guess that I would just like to put in my, advocacy to
Sure.
say that good design can be, advocated for in a public sense without, and there are many examples around the community. Madison is one of those. Portland is another one of those.
Madison, Wisconsin, Portland, Oregon.
Where the community has very strong wishes about how their community is going to be, and where everyone gets on board to make that happen. And I feel like many times we're scared to do that because we think that it's going to put a damper on development. And everyone wants development to happen, but I think that you can also balance that with how you want the public good to be met through design. So,
Unfortunately, both Urbana and Champaign did not step forward and get LEED ratings for both of the new libraries. And so that sort of is a statement by both of those communities, and the way they didn't put an emphasis on the importance of that.
Right, and I don't know the history. I know that the Urbana Library project has been on the boards for so many years that, as I said, I think there's been a mushrooming of interest both on the public's part as well as on the design AE, architecture and engineering part, to create more green buildings. That's really happened in the last 10 years 5 years, some would say. And I don't know, the project you're talking about, in some cases, predate that
The one in
interest.
Urbana does, the
Yeah.
one in Champaign, it was a matter that the
Sure.
city council
Sure.
wouldn't vote the extra $50,000 to go through the process of
Right.
obtaining
Well,
a lead rating.
That's you don't have to have. You can commit yourself to design to LEED standards without paying the money to have it evaluated and certified as LEED. So, at the very least, what I would say is, why don't you say, we would like you to design to these standards? And I think that that's what a lot of, I worked on a Job Corps campus, for instance, outside of Washington, D.C., and the GSA didn't pay for the building to be certified, or the campus to be certified, but they said, these are the guidelines that we would like you to be using. And it's in the same ways that a city would adopt a certain zoning code to say this is the standards you need to adopt when you're designing for our community. Similar guidelines could be adopted for any community as far as sustainability goes. So.
Before we close our conversation, tell me a bit about your educational background, and have you been in the Champaign-Urbana area a long time? I heard you allude to being in Washington, D.C., so that answers my question.
Yeah, I've been an architect for only 10 years. This is my second career. I was a stage designer in New York for almost 14 years. My undergraduate degree is from UC San Diego, and that degree was in drama. I moved to New York in the late 70s and practiced through the 80s and into the 90s, early 90s in set design. Was also designing some interiors at that time, and I really wanted to expand the context in which I was designing. So in the early 90s, I went back to get a Master's of Architecture at Yale. And I graduated from Yale in '94, practiced in New York with a small firm in New York for a year and a half, and then came to Central Illinois. My wife had an appointment at the law school and here at the university. And so I practiced with a number of good firms here in town. I've had the good fortune to have good work here in town. And then moved back to the East Coast again and practiced with a firm in Washington, D.C., where I had a chance to design custom residential work and design theaters, which was a great thing for me to be able to go back to combine my architectural work and my theater background. So, and that's what I'm really doing now. I've come back here to join the faculty here and have started a practice of my own, and am doing a lot of very interesting custom residential projects here for families that I'm very excited about, and am doing theater design as well. I just had a premiere of a project at the Krannert Center, set design, and I'm also consulting with the Krannert about a long-range planning study for a potential expansion of their facility. So.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So besides Leo School Edition, what else can we see in the community that you have designed?
I worked with Mental Health Center to design their Time Center, which is a transitional housing and men's shelter, which is a project probably most people don't know. It's tucked away in downtown Champaign.
That's right.
And was a great project for me because of the mission of the project. I think that's what excites me most about many of the projects that I have is the mission of the project is always very interesting to me, and how I'm able to flesh that out into spatial and form terms into a beautiful design, but really stick to and enhance the mission of whatever I'm working on. So I did a lot of work with Urbana schools for the referendum before the schools, up until when the referendum happened for the expansion of the middle school and the Leal School and the pool project, and then I concentrated on the Leal project, which I designed.
Well, that's a very nice design. It enhances that neighborhood
area.
area.
I think it responds well to the existing.
It does.
The existing building, and I think they have a ways to go to create the landscaping around it. I think we envisioned. And what other projects? I worked in one of my first projects here. I worked with a team that designed Countryside School, which is a private non-sectarian school out on the west side of town. That was a great project. They were a small school and a storefront, you know, in a shopping mall when we
Right.
talked to them, and really enthusiastic about the educational programs, which, you know, have been great. And I was part of the team that, when I was working at Architectural Spectrum, who designed that facility, so that's been a while. I should say that I was working with Isaacs and Glarum here in
Huh.
Urbana when I was working on the school district work with Vic Isaacson very closely, who's done a lot of a lot of the work for the schools here. Worked with Riley Glarum to design some work for Lincolnshire Fields Country Club,
Oh, okay.
additions to that facility, several additions to that facility. And have always had my hand in custom residential work here as well. So projects that I won't name the families' names.
Right, no, we don't want to do that, but
Are, you know, things that I'm very proud of in the community here.
so you can fold the practical aspect of your profession to the classroom and the classroom back to the
I like
practical
to. I like to.
aspect.
And I think that that's very important also for the students. You know,
It
I
is.
think that there's a architecture school shouldn't be strictly a vocational, you know, it shouldn't be something that is only about the practice of architecture, because there's so much rich culture. I mean, it is both both an art form and a practical part of our society, and both of those things really need to be emphasized in architecture school. And I try and make sure that both the practical and the sort of aesthetic or conceptual, I guess I would say, are focused on in what I do in the classroom. And, you know, have enough built experience to make sure that I don't, you know, stray too far into the theoretical area, and I have enough, I think, conceptual interest that I don't stray so far into the practical that it's not based in some kind of theory or concept too.
This has been a fabulous conversation.
Oh, well, I'm so glad that you invited me. It's really,
I
really
really
been fun.
appreciate it, and I'm only halfway through
Mhm.
my list of ideas, so it's very clear. I want to invite you to come back, and we'll do
Well,
the
I
second
appreciate the
half
invitation.
of all the ideas that I had down to talk with you. Our special thanks to Thomas Kamm, an architect and a professor in the School of Architecture, for joining me today in the community planning conversation.